right. Thank you so much for joining. I am Jake with the Market Leader Podcast, and today we are interviewing, and I think we're super lucky to have Morgan here. Morgan was a part of Bookkeeping for Painters. I was say Pro Painter Network. That's what you're doing now. Bookkeeping for Painters. She exited out of that. We're kind of diving a little bit about that stuff. But really, I wanted Morgan to come on here and help talk about the hard stuff, the financial side, the side that, not a lot of people feel super comfortable talking about until they get comfortable with it. And then they kind of realize how having professional help with it can really help the business and really is a necessity. So Morgan, could you kind of start off by introducing yourself, kind of what you got going on?
Sure. Yeah. So, Jake, I appreciate you having me on. I think most of you guys probably initially got familiar with me, whether it was in the painting industry or in another skilled trade space, through the work that I was doing in our accounting firm. So like you mentioned, for a while, I was a partner over there at Online Bookkeep, where we did business as Bookkeeping for Painters and Bookkeeping for Trades. And essentially, I was the head of advisory over there. So I spent a lot of years working as basically a fractional CFO for skilled trade contractors all across the spectrum, trained a team of advisors under me, did a lot of work as a tax practitioner and tax advisor during those times. I did exit that partnership at the beginning of last year, so I've since moved into more broad advisory waters. I'm pleased to say that these days I'm pretty much full-time in the coaching and consulting space for contractors. My husband and I were lucky enough to actually acquire the Pro Painter Network last year, like you mentioned, which is an educational association specifically geared towards working with painting contractors. So I love getting to be an educational resource and continue to do advisory, create some coursework and things like that through that as an avenue. But yeah, like you said, the accounting, the financials, the bookkeeping, it's the elephant in the room a lot of the time whenever we're talking about anything that's a business foundation or fundamental. So I love any opportunity that I can to still talk through that with people because it's such a big pain point and it's such a critical foundation for all of the other work that you're trying to do in a business.
Yeah, it really is and it's like a huge, because I've been there, I've owned and sold a painting company. It's like a big, weight on their shoulders when they're just trying to they're kind of half doing it, kind of cowboying it, doing it whenever they can. It's like a huge kind of stressor. And as you get bigger, it becomes more of a stressor. And then you finally kind of get it handled. And it's like amazing the amount of, it's like you can breathe for the first time once it actually gets handled and things are being taken care of. Can you kind of talk a little bit about your history, kind of what made you want to get into this? Why painters?
Oh, great question. So, we go way back in the day. I grew up in a skilled trades family. So all of the men in my family are different types of contractors. My dad and my brother are both welding contractors. My dad's done a lot of pipe fitting, and I think now is basically the head of operational construction for a wastewater management company down in the Houston, Texas area. I've got some master electricians in the family, carpenters, no painters in the immediate vicinity of family, but craftsmen have always been something that's very near and dear because that's just the family that I grew up in. So back in the day, whenever I was headed off to school, I knew that I wanted to do business. I really enjoyed a lot of business and entrepreneurial related concepts. So I studied entrepreneurial management, actually leveraged that into a really interesting few years working in the nonprofit space though. So what I realized is that whether you're in nonprofits or whether you're in small businesses, there's a lot of different things to do in the world of business. So I loved nonprofits because they were really passionate, driven organizations that I got to wear a lot of hats within. But I exited working in the nonprofit space whenever I started having my kids. So I took a few years off working with my kids. And when I wanted to break back into work, I chose to do it through the avenue of bookkeeping because I recognized that bookkeeping and tax work was the foot in the door to all of the information that's running through businesses. And I knew that ultimately my big interest was working in the advisory sphere. So I started working with contractors in my local area. At the time I was in Tucson, Arizona. And within a few months, a really cool opportunity opened up to join up and become part of the team over there at Bookkeeping for Painters because they were in a pretty big transitionary period and we were connected through kind of a mastermind network. So I jumped on board there, had a lot of luck, basically serving as the operational partner for a number of years until it was just time for me to kind of move on and take a look at doing some of my own project work. So that was how I got in for painters specifically, because that was an area that my former partners were really, really niched down into. And I actually helped them expand beyond working just within the painting industry and get more involved with other types of contractors, since it's the work that we do on the accounting side, just like a lot of business development, is pretty consistent. Skilled trades have a lot of similarities no matter what niche you're in.
I love it. So, but there's something about painters though for you, because obviously
Yes.
you just got the Pro Painter Network. Like, is it something you got into and you just love the people there, or did you fall in love? Like, what happened?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So in the work that I was doing back in the accounting firm days, obviously just spent a ton of time in the painting industry, developing a lot of really beautiful relationships with all of the other coaches, the Painting Contractors Association. I'm still really pleased and happy to be majorly active and involved on the PCA side of things. And that was one of the things I was really happy about with acquiring the Pro Painter Network, was actually being able to create a really brilliant alliance between those two associations. And I just have always really had a heart for the education side of the industry, because truth be told, I spend a lot of time in other industry spaces too. So I actually spend a ton of time in the digital marketing space. And lately I've been spending a lot of time in more tech savvy spaces. Like, I've been learning a lot about artificial intelligence and those kinds of tools, because I really love seeing what other industries are doing well and what kinds of tactics and tricks that they have been adopting that have been really pushing those industries and those businesses forward. I love finding out about those things and translating them back into our space, translating them back into the painting industry or other skilled trades businesses, because the amount of leverage that they offer us are so powerful. But with painters in particular, yeah, I've been working more deeply with painting businesses than any other trade for the longest amount of time. So it's where I have the most relationships and friendships, and I love it.
That's so cool. I love that too. I never expected to be in a painting as much as we have, and we kind of same boat. Just get connected, and you can't leave once you're in.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, what are you've worked with and you've partnered with? You've seen a lot of behind the scenes with a lot of painters. What are some of the biggest issues that they're experiencing when they first kind of reach out to you and connect with you? Things like that. What are kind of the main things that they're struggling with?
Great question. I would say probably one of the first hurdles that a lot of painters encounter and that a lot of small businesses encounter, especially when it comes to, well, it's relevant when it comes to financials, but it's really relevant to all parts of their business, which is that they're wearing too many hats, right? We get to a point where most of the time, whenever you launch a business, you're doing everything. You're wearing all of the hats. And we realize that in order to create stability in a business, we need to start adding some additional people to the team. We need to start passing some of those hats off so that you're not the center focus point of everything as the owner. Financial management is one of those things that the owner tends to hold on to the longest for a few different reasons, and it makes sense. And sometimes it can be pretty well advised. So one of the biggest reasons first is security, right? You like to be the one handling money. You like to be the one that has your eyes on all of that, because at first it can be kind of hard to figure out who and how to plug in there to take some of those responsibilities off of your plate. So that's one reason why we tend to see business owners hold on to that for a while. Obviously, it's really important to be able to produce work as we scale up. So whenever we start building out our teams and growing as a business, we're usually focused more primarily on adding some additional techs in the field, and then getting a general type of administrative assistant coming on board to help with things that are more related to marketing. We're focused really hard on getting the work and doing the work, right? Tracking what's happening with the work kind of tends to fall towards the bottom of that list. So that is one of the things that I see most business owners kind of start to struggle with, is that by the time they get to a point where they almost have the luxury of the bandwidth to be able to sit down and look at the financials, there's already so much going on in the business that they're like, where do I even begin with tracking all of this? A lot of them try to keep DIYing it. So that's one big pain point, is trying to continue to do something like that really isn't your skill set. It's not your area of expertise in the business. So it's just not very efficient for you to be doing it. And then the next step that I tend to see a lot of business owners lean into is when they get to the point where they've grown the team enough that they now have an admin, maybe a full-time admin. They think, well, I have this admin that I'm paying full-time. I need to put all of the admin things on their plate. And we know that there's a lot of different types of admin things, right? There's things that are very front of office, they're very customer facing, they might have a lot to do with coordinating and assisting your techs in the field. So they're a little more social or communication driven. And then there are more tracking oriented, paperwork oriented pieces of administrative work that require a lot of deep focus and in some cases, a lot of deep software knowledge or some other foundational skill sets. Those two administrative skill set pieces don't usually mesh very well together, actually. It's kind of hard to ask one person to encapsulate all of those pieces. So that tends to be kind of the second stop that I see a lot of business owners struggling with, is that they've had an admin that they feel like is supposed to be doing financial tracking, but it's a little bit hiccupy, probably because we're asking that person to do too many things that are fairly disparate from each other. That context switching can be really, really hard to ask of a team member. And the bookkeeping and accounting side is a pretty high skill role and position, right? There's a lot of foundational knowledge that goes into doing that really well. So by the time we kind of take a look at it and we realize that, it usually becomes pretty wise for business owners to start thinking about maybe outsourcing it and bringing in a skilled expert to come in and do that for the business.
Yes. Super agree. We talk about this internally here. There's a difference between bandwidth and mental bandwidth. You can have the time, just because they have the time to do it doesn't mean that they have the mental bandwidth to do it. Because tasks take up, it's just, you can burn out. I think they can only handle like 1 to 3 things majorly, and it has to be, it's kind of interesting.
The next part there, real quick, or just something that, might take an hour if you have the ability to fully focus in on it, can end up taking 3 or 4 if you're constantly having to triage other things that are coming through the business, which is really common for small businesses that have like a one main administrator role. So it becomes an efficiency problem for the business owner, right? Like now this one thing that we thought we had an expectation of it only taking X amount of time is taking 4 times as long. And we need to get a little more selective about how we're utilizing the time of our team members.
Yes. Also priorities. I've worked with companies who've done this exact thing, and the poor people, those poor admin people, they don't know which one to prioritize, because what happens when the accounting and the marketing thing that they were asked to do and the phone's ringing at the same time, and yet all of them are top priority, and they have to now choose, and now they feel pressure and they're making decisions that they shouldn't be having to make because they're doing things they shouldn't necessarily have to do.
That's a great point.
Yeah, they're not set up to win necessarily in that,
that's a great
moment.
Yeah. And on that note too, about setting up this person to win, that's actually one of the other big areas of conflict that I see a lot for small business owners and painting business owners when it comes to bookkeeping, which is that typically the personality type and the skill set that's involved in doing something like bookkeeping and accounting work, doing it at a really high level and doing it really well, those tend to be really high conscientiousness ranking personality types. So in like the DISC personality profile, we would call those really, really high Cs, high attention to detail, very, very process driven people are really good at those roles. So that's who you need doing that for you in your business. But most entrepreneurs are the opposite end of the spectrum, right? They tend to be very extroverted personalities or very high energy. Oftentimes they're more driven by a variety of tasks. That's usually what people with those personality types are the ones that gravitate towards being an entrepreneur. So because they're at the opposite end of the spectrums, the person in the role that you have trying to do the bookkeeping usually feels like a big friction and agitation point for the business owner. So it can be really hard when you know that you need somebody to be doing this type of tracking, but it's also the last priority on the business owner's list most of the time. And it can become a pretty big source of conflict internally when the person who you've put in charge of trying to do this tracking and try to keep this information on point feels like they're always struggling to get that information out of the rest of the team or get whatever information they need out of the business owner. So that I find tends to be a pretty big personality and communication conflict point that can leave everyone kind of feeling like they're going crazy and there's no really forward progress being made.
Yeah. And it's going to make that person look bad. They're going to feel bad. They're not going to feel like they're doing a good job. The morale is going to start to go down. It's like, it really does start to affect everything. Off just like one little, oh, you can do this, right?
Exactly.
Tank. off of that point, I'm in a lot of the same communities you are, and there's a lot of people who will say, hop in there and be like, I'm starting a new company, right? Whether it's painting or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I always see, the guys who have successfully run companies, maybe they're on their second or third, they always hop in there and they say the same thing: hire a bookkeeper day one. They never say hire marketing day one, get a website day one, find anything else. Every single one says the same thing: get a bookkeeper day one. Doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, it makes your life so much easier from the get-go. And the other big reason why we honestly should be prioritizing financial tracking so early on is because it's the only way that you know or understand what the hell you're doing in the business. Like so I love to tell people that your business is like a giant experiment, right? You're constantly changing all of these variables and you're trying to drive these end results. And what's the first thing that they teach you about the scientific method whenever you're coming up through school? Is that for you to have a good idea of what impacts you're having on things, you've got to limit the number of variables you're dealing with. So that's the first one. But the second one is that you've got to measure everything. You have to be able to see, what am I changing and what's the impact? And if you're not measuring things through the bookkeeping, you are running blind, even though you might not feel that you are. So a lot of business owners, if they don't get a bookkeeper on day one, then they find that they're managing from the bank account, which is like shooting from the hip, because we know that there's a lot of times that you might have money in the bank account, but the business is doing terribly. It's really struggling, or it's bleeding money, or the opposite. You could be operating in a way that's really profitable, but because of your cash flow issues, you're not seeing any of that in the bank account. And either way, you can't tell what's working well or what's struggling unless you have somewhere that you can turn and look to start getting to the bottom of those variables and really starting to identify those red flags. So that's what I love telling business owners about the financials whenever we first kind of sit down and we start talking through it, which is that I know that this has been a major source of anxiety for you probably in the past, but all of the answers that you're looking for live here. As soon as we get the tracking dialed in, which is never as hard as people think that it's going to be, what the financial reporting should be for you at its bare minimum is a great red flagging system, so that whenever you are wondering how things are doing, or you know that there's a problem and you need to figure out what to do, what that problem is so you can address it, you turn and you look at the reports and the answers are all there. They tell you exactly what part of the business you need to look into, exactly where you need to go. And usually it's pretty easy to start identifying, how to lean into those problem areas, try something new, and you know that you're being really focused and precise about all of the things you're doing as a leader.
I love it. So I feel like, and tell me if I'm wrong, if the business owner is having the feeling at the end of the month, they look at their stuff, their financials, their bank account, whatever, and they have the thought, where did all my money go? Then they're in that position. If you've had that thought, you need to bring on some help.
Yesterday. Yeah. You needed to be looking at it, or you need some help taking a look at what it is. Because where did the money go, or what am I doing? And then a lot of the times, even the question of where do I go next? Even if you feel like you've got a pretty good handle on how the business is doing right now, I hear that so much from business owners too, where they get in touch about the coaching side of things, or they talk about consulting and wanting to grow the business. They're like, there's all of these different things that I know that I could be doing and should be doing eventually, but where do I start? Those answers are in the financials too.
I love it. So I have two different paths I'm going to go down. I'm going to stick to a little bit of the bookkeeping, and then I want to get into a little bit more of the maybe CFO-ish kind of stuff that you're working with.
Let's do it.
So to finish out the bookkeeping, what questions should they be asking a bookkeeper that they're talking to? On this point, I saw your recent post in the Business Brush group. Shout out if you need help. Morgan is there. And someone had asked if the pricing was good or something like that, and you had asked for the pricing, and then they gave someone had mentioned a really low price, and you were like, oh goodness, red flags, right? What are some of the questions people should be asking? What are some red flags they should be looking for when they're looking at bookkeepers and getting financial help?
I love you for asking this, because I love keeping things really practical. So when you're looking for somebody to take care of this, what should you be looking for? What should you be asking? So the question that you're referring to, Jake, was somebody asked, like, what's reasonable service prices for bookkeepers, right? So any sort of bookkeeping company that you might, or an individual bookkeeper that you might be hiring into the business to help you run and manage things. Obviously, prices have been going up on that, just like everything else across the board, right? We've all seen that impact of inflation. my experience from working really deeply in that industry for a lot of years and still being really embedded in the financial reporting for a ton of different contractors is that most anybody who is offering bookkeeping services as a company, as a service, so this means that they're an expert in it and that's what they do, they're probably not going to be able to work with a company for less than about $300 to $350 a month. That's really when you have the level of knowledge that you have as a skilled bookkeeper, that's really kind of like your minimum client billing amount that you could start working with somebody for the amount of time that it takes to even just look at bank accounts, even if there's not a lot of transactions running through, the time that it takes to look at things, verify them, take the time that it takes to perform reconciliations, and then to communicate, even if it's just via email with that business about any questions or holes. So you guys could probably imagine this. It's kind of like, even if you had a really small painting project or somebody's like, I just need one wall painted, right? Or I just have a patch that I need done. We know that there's really more to it than that, right? You have to like take the time to drive out there, get all the equipment. You probably can't just paint a patch. You've got to do at least a whole wall or something like that to actually make it look good and do what needs to be done for a good end product. So there's a minimum amount of time required for any kind of bookkeeping, no matter how small you are as a business. That from my experience, I have seen that $300 to $350 benchmark is really the bottom of it. So honestly, any business that you feel like, well, I have so little going on that, I can't even afford to pay that, you're probably still in the DIY realm, or you're in the realm where you'd have to pay your accountant at the end of the year to put everything together. Okay. So that's a pretty good earmark there. I have seen a couple of people mention that they have great experiences, maybe with a local bookkeeper or someone that they have a local connection with that is charging way less, like $150, $200. That's kind of the one that I was like, ooh, that gives me that makes me feel a little bit icky because I know how much time it takes. So it could be true that somebody is doing great work, but this is just one of those things like we see and we complain about a lot in the painting industry, which is like sometimes we just know that people bid way below what it takes to actually run a healthy business or actually do a healthy service price for themselves. So it's possible. Some people have it, some people can find it, but to me, that would be a pretty big red flag. One of the other things that you're going to want to ask when it comes to finding a bookkeeping service provider, you're going to want to find somebody that specializes in the software that you want to use. And these days, most of the time, that's probably going to be QuickBooks Online. One of the other major competitors to QuickBooks Online would be another online accounting software called Xero, which is actually spelled Xero, but pronounced Zero. Those two tend to be the main competitors. There's a third one out there, FreshBooks, that I've heard of, but just so you guys have an idea, like market share here between QuickBooks Online versus Xero and FreshBooks, it's like QuickBooks Online, QBO is probably 95% of the market. Those other guys are probably fighting for about 5%, if that. But when it comes to bookkeeping and it comes to accounting, there's a couple of major pieces of foundational knowledge that anyone who's going to do that for your business needs to have. The first part is they need to have a pretty basic, at least a basic understanding, in some cases, a moderate to high level of understanding about general accounting principles. This is what we call double entry accounting, and it's what all of these systems are built to help facilitate. Okay. If you don't have a good understanding of basic accounting principles, you're kind of running blind a little bit inside of QuickBooks because there's a lot of double entry and things that it's kind of totally lost on people, and it creates a lot of mess inside of the books if you don't understand those principles. The other side of it is you have to have a pretty high level of software knowledge. And unfortunately, this software knowledge doesn't really translate well from platform to platform. They're very different from each other. So if you want to run on Xero and you're interviewing somebody whose specialty is QuickBooks Online, that's going to be a no for you. They are not going to translate well. It's not going to be efficient. They're not going to know how to use that software well. So just know that whoever you're interviewing, whatever software they're used to using, you're probably going to have to migrate over to that and be willing to use whatever they give you. QuickBooks Online right now is pretty much the norm, and almost all of us are moving towards these online softwares because they integrate with other things that we might be using in the business. One of the third things that I would say is really important for you to ask that bookkeeper, you need to ask them about how frequently they're going to be doing updates in your books. By the time you're thinking about hiring a bookkeeper, come in and kind of take this off of your plate, my goal and my hope for everyone is that they have at least monthly updates happening in their books. Monthly is really the bare minimum that you need to be able to keep a good finger on the pulse of everything that's happening in the business. So that monthly update cycle is really important. And I want you to know really clearly how frequently they're supposed to be doing that. so you can hold them accountable to it. You should be able to go in and say, hey, you're supposed to be doing this every month and you haven't done anything for 2 months. What's up? So that's a really critical piece of that. Trying to think if there's anything else critically important here. Communication. How are they going to ask you for things? What's the best way for you guys to communicate back and forth? That way, if they're doing updates on a monthly basis, they should be touching base with you once a month, asking you for clarification about anything that they don't understand. So those are probably the 4 main things that I would say are really critically important to be keeping in mind.
I love it. I'm writing stuff down here too.
Yeah, good.
What are some of the dangers of not following these? What have you seen happen?
Sure.
Great
question, actually. So I can actually speak from some really recent examples. So I still do a lot of coordination and deep dive into financials in my current role as a coach and a consultant. So just today, I was diving into some financials with a contractor client of mine, and it became really clear to us that even though he had been paying this bookkeeper for about a month and was under the impression that this bookkeeper was going to be doing some weekly bookkeeping. Nothing had been done in the books since he onboarded. So, that could just be a miscommunication issue there, but, they were supposed to be doing some cleanup for the current year. And we're already about 6 weeks into the current year. There were already a couple hundred transactions sitting in the books. And I told him, hey, this is priority numero uno. You got to get some clarification about when are they going to get this caught up and when are you going to be doing weekly updates? Because we got to know, we got to know what's going on in the business if we're going to keep changing and growing effectively. So if you don't know with real clarity how often and how frequently they're going to be going in there, that could be a problem. I have another contractor right now who, whenever we've been going through and doing some review in his books, he has a few areas that have some major gaps in information. So there's a couple of things in his books that the bookkeeper has been updating routinely, but he noticed that things are being put in the wrong spots, and that's a problem, right? He didn't notice this until he went and looked at it after the fact. So now he knows, hey, there's a breakdown in communication here. There's a couple of other pieces too that just aren't getting updated in his books that are big problems because they could potentially be creating duplicates in his revenue and things like that. And I've asked him, is your bookkeeper asking you about these things? Like, has he been asking you for information so that he can resolve these? Because when I look at it, I know that those issues have been going on for months and months without any resolution. So that my question is, has this person been communicating with you about information that they need and you just haven't been giving it to them? And this client was like, no, he hasn't said anything about it. So I know there's probably a gap in knowledge here with that bookkeeper. So unfortunately, we did come to the conclusion he probably needs to check out some other vendors and providers. But there wasn't clarity between them about when are we going to talk about these things? How are we going to talk about these things? They were just kind of emailing each other ad hoc. Things get lost in the shuffle. There's no real routine set down for anything. So these issues start to compile and we get 5 or 6 months down the road and it's a big mess and taxes are due. And now we're struggling to play catch up. So those are some good examples there. When there's a software mismatch, I've actually seen this happen a lot when maybe a company has an admin in-house or they have a bookkeeper who's been doing QuickBooks Desktop for them for a long time. But now they want to move to online. They're looking to update and take advantage of some different integrations. So they try to use the same bookkeeper and move onto the online platform. And suddenly bookkeeping is taking 4 times longer than it was taking before. And also we're actually creating problems in QuickBooks Online and creating problematic records because the same way that you would do something in desktop actually doesn't translate to online. Those are 2 other really big different softwares. There are some similarities, but there's also some pretty big gaps and differences in how those things happen. So without meaning to, a bookkeeper that was probably pretty proficient in the desktop software is now creating issues in the online software. Those are just some of the red flags that I've seen firsthand, some of the hiccups that have cropped up.
Awesome. That leads into my next question. How do I know that they're doing a good job? So you talked about you didn't find out until someone else took a look and audited. A lot of the same issues in marketing too, right? But for you, how do I know that they're doing a good job?
Super great question. So this is one that so I've actually, since leaving the field practicing as a fractional CFO, I still get a lot of requests for information about it. So I was trying to think, how can I still put good information out there? And I'm actually in the process of creating an online course right now that I'm calling the Contractors CFO course that's going to live in one of my partner platforms, which is called Home Pro Toolbox. So Home Pro Toolbox membership is one of the membership benefits of being in the Pro Painter network. So anyone who's in the network at that level will have access to that course, but it's also one that you guys can keep an eye out for if you're interested in it. We'll probably talk about it in the Business Brush group and things like that. But one of the things that I'm doing in that course is actually doing a live walkthrough of the exact audit process that I put a set of QuickBooks through whenever I was practicing in the accounting firm. So it's the exact process that I would walk through if I was taking a look at a new set of clients' books and I was putting together a report for them about all of the potential issues or the things that look good. So if I'm trying to identify what I need to go clean up as an accountant, this is the process that I would go through to give that feedback back to that customer or that contractor. So for you guys, there's some level of kind of technical knowledge that if you're an experienced bookkeeper, obviously it's a lot easier to go in and tell what's going on, but I can give you a couple of quick hints. Okay. So the first one would be whichever system you're using, there is an element to that system that we call a bank feed. And it's a feed from your bank accounts and from your credit card accounts of transactions. Every time you swipe a card, every time you cut a check, your bank sends that information into the bookkeeping software. So wherever that lives will be a little bit different depending on what software you have, but we call it the bank feed. And in QuickBooks, it usually lives under a tab that's called banking. When you click into that, it shows you how many transactions are sitting in the bank feed and the dates that they came in versus whenever they have been added to the books, they disappear from the bank feed. So that's one really quick and easy way to tell, is somebody doing their job? You can log in and you can see how many transactions are just sitting in here hanging out and how far back do they come from? If they go back 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, a year, then your bookkeeper's probably not going in there and actually adding transactions to the books like they're supposed to be, because if they are adding them in, they disappear from the bank feed. So that's one really good way of checking. If you're a QuickBooks Online user, one of the other really big issues that I see a lot is that a lot of the times we like an online software like QBO because we want to integrate it with our production tool that we're invoicing from, right? Whether we're using Jobber or Estimate Rocket, Service Titan, whether any number of these guys that we might be using, Paint Scout, Workglue, we like to try to integrate these two systems together. So every time I send an invoice over there, it shows up here in QuickBooks. That can be great, but your bookkeeper needs to have a very specific process in place for making sure that every single time you send an invoice and it shows up in QuickBooks, whenever you actually collect that payment and it comes through the bank, the payment that comes through the bank needs to be matched to that invoice, right? And that is a critical part of a bookkeeping process that I see a lot of places and a lot of bookkeepers totally overlook. And what ends up happening is you end up having a giant long list of open invoices, or what looks like open invoices. And you have a whole bunch of deposits that came into the bank that don't have a customer name attached to them. They just get added as revenue. And this starts to compound and accumulate as a problem. And when you're trying to run an accrual level report where you want to look at your invoices as well as your collected revenue together, it can create a lot of duplicate income, which is a really big problem. Now, the easiest way to tell if that's happening is there's a feature inside of QBO that's called bank deposits. So usually whenever you get into QBO, in your upper left-hand corner, there's just a big old plus sign that you can kind of do anything from. You click that plus sign, there's a button that's called bank deposits. When you click that button, there's either a very clean little dashboard that should be pretty concise and it should only have recent invoices that have not yet been deposited in the bank. Or when you click into there, you will find a horror show of hundreds of deposits that go back a year, all of these customers that have already paid you and have already been deposited, but were not actually matched up properly to bank deposits. So that is a really critical piece that really gets kind of left and tossed to the side, and a lot of businesses can create a big headache. The third place to look is going to be at your reconciliation reports. So no matter what system you're using, there should be a report that you're able to pull that's a reconciliation report or a reconciliation summary. And it's going to look like a pretty concise little list of information about, for each period, the ins and the outs, and then what date it was reconciled, what the balance in that account was the day that you reconciled it, and the statement that you reconciled it against. What a lot of people don't know is you might have a bookkeeper that's going in and reconciling, and you might see on a report somewhere that this was reconciled this month. This was reconciled this month. But what they don't know is that you can force a reconciliation. So when you force a reconciliation, you force it to say reconciled. So it checks that block whenever you're looking at a high level summary. But when you open it up and you look at the reconciliation report, you'll start to see discrepancies. It'll say, here was the QuickBooks balance the day that we reconciled, and here was the statement balance. They should be the exact same number. Sometimes they're thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars off. And the reason that happens is because at some point, some month, somebody forced a reconciliation through, even though there were things on the books that maybe weren't showing up in the bank account or vice versa. And then the next month they just kept doing it. And if those issues snowball over time. So I have literally seen over $100,000 reconciliation discrepancy before, because this problem was happening for over a year and it just kept snowballing on itself. The business owner had no idea because they were looking at a high level report that was like, thumbs up, reconciled. They never looked at a detailed reconciliation report that shows, hey, there was actually a pretty big difference here between these two documents, and they just forced it through. So again, the key word on that is called a reconciliation report. The report will show you inside of an individual account if there were any discrepancies on that. The bank balance and the QBO balance and the statement balance should be the same every time you reconcile. Otherwise, it wasn't a true reconciliation.
Gotcha. That's a lot. I love it.
Yeah, that is a lot. Yeah.
But I think it's really important because it's like you need to know enough to be dangerous. You know, you need to know enough to be able to tell if someone is doing a good job. And the same exact thing is with marketing. Like, how do you know if your marketer is doing a good job? Know enough to be dangerous, right?
Exactly right.
In fact, our best clients usually know enough to be dangerous because they know when we're doing a good job, things like that, you know?
Yeah.
The next one I have here is, as a business owner, what can I do to make my bookkeeper, financial person's job as easy as possible? Make them love me, make them do a great job.
Stop mixing business and personal expenses on the same credit cards. So that's going to be your first one. If you can just keep that really well streamlined, not only does it protect you more as a business owner, because when you start to mix and mingle, you're actually eroding some of your protections as an LLC. So conceivably, if you were to ever get sued, the court could come back and say, well, you were mixing stuff anyway, so we're going to consider all of your personal assets as part of the mix. You definitely don't want that. So just know you're protecting yourself, but you're also making it a lot easier for your bookkeeper to get into some good rhythms and understand what's going on in the books and not have to take the time to weed out those things that are actually personal. The second piece is you definitely want to have a good receipt collection software in place. This is as easy as finding something that you can just take photos of documents with and your bookkeeper has access to it. And then the good ones, they can actually connect them with QuickBooks. So they're really tying all of those documents together. This makes your bookkeeper's job a lot easier. It usually makes all of your team's lives a lot easier because now they don't have to like juggle paperwork all the time. They don't have to like stuff receipts in a weird shoebox in their truck. They just take a photo of it and they throw it in the trash, which is a lot easier for everybody. And again, it's actually better protection for you because now you have an audit proofing mechanism. The IRS ever comes back and wants to spot check some things, they want to see receipts. This is a big one that I like to remind people of. People are like, well, I have my credit card statements. Like they can just look at my credit card statements. The IRS knows that your bank statement or your credit card statement is proof that you spent money, and it's proof of where you spent money. It is not proof of how you spent that money at that location. They want to see itemized receipts for things. So you got to take photos of those and hold those things in reserve.
Great tips. Yes. I love it. And I have a feeling, because I think I know that, I know at least FreshBooks does this, but QuickBooks, things like that, they have like an app where you can just really quickly like take a picture of it and connect it, make it super easy. That's right.
They do. So most of the softwares like QuickBooks Online and FreshBooks have that. So if you want to use that, it's a good starting point. One thing that I will say as a caveat there, it can be pretty good to actually consider using a third-party software that's only job is collecting those receipts, because when the accounting software, the bookkeeping software is asking you to do it, normally they want you to label things while you're taking those photos. So you're actually coding stuff. You're doing bookkeeping while you're taking those photos, which means it's not easy to give your team access to it, because then your team is actually bookkeeping and coding things maybe where they shouldn't be. So that's one thing. And then you have to give more team members access to the books than you kind of want to, because it's usually all the same app. Like you have to add them as users. So for those two reasons, I really like finding a standalone software. And the two industry leaders are a software called Dext and a software called HubDoc. Those two are the number one easiest ones, where it's literally point and click and it's submitted. And then the rest of it becomes your bookkeeper's job. So, something's better than nothing. If you can use the FreshBooks software, the QuickBooks software, and that works for you, great. But as you scale up as a business, one of those other softwares, still pretty cheap, $15 a month usually, but well worth it. They're also easier to search through and things like that.
Gotcha. Perfect. I wrote this down for even us.
Good.
Last thing on the bookkeeping stuff, and then love to get into a little bit more of the CFO things. The difference between, because we talked about kind of what the bare minimum is with bookkeeping at $350. I get a pitch or something like that for something that's $700, $800. I know we personally are paying significantly more than that, but we're getting a lot more for it. What's kind of the difference, and what's the service level difference between the low cost and one of these higher cost ones? Because it's not all the same.
Sure. The cost is always going to scale up as you become a larger business. So that $300 to $350 amount, if you're going to hire a professional, that's probably the minimum they're going to have to charge. And you're probably at a point to do that and make that hiring decision comfortably when you're doing at least $300,000 a year in revenue, because then it becomes about 1 to 1.5% of your revenue. As you scale up, something that you guys can keep in mind as kind of a rule of thumb here is that when you're small, so if you're less than $1 million a year in revenue, you might spend as much as 3% on accounting and bookkeeping. So that's going to be filing your taxes, getting all those things taken care of, and bookkeeping expense. Because when you're a little bit smaller, it's just a little bit of a bigger bite to pay pros to do it. But as you get larger than $1 million a year in revenue, most companies, they earmark about 1% of their revenue towards their accounting department. So whether that's VAs that are handling like your accounts payable and your accounts receivable, plus a bookkeeping outsource company, plus your accountant who's doing your tax returns, 1 to 1.5% of revenue is pretty doable. People that I know that do really great high-level outsourced CFO work, like my friend Annie Newton, who does this for a lot of really large commercial contractors, that's about where she has people budget and earmark, and how she bases her fees is really around 1% of revenue for companies, even at the point where they're doing 8, 9, 10 million a year in revenue and above. She's doing full service. She steps in, she even does some HR function, and she does all of their bookkeeping, does some administration, and then obviously CFO level advisory. But that's how those guys pay for it. So you can kind of think about that similarly for your own internal budget. Now, the apples to oranges comparison that you might see is going to be, does it include software? Does it not include software? Your software fees could start to creep up a bit. QuickBooks, you might be paying anywhere from 40 to 70 or up. Something like receipt collection, maybe another 15 to 20. Maybe you're paying a little bit more too for tax related software. So does it include or not include software fees? How frequently are you getting updates? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? That's going to be a big one there. Are they just doing cash basis accounting, which would basically be they're not looking at any other softwares. They're just looking at your bank accounts. They're just adding things as they hit the bank account. Or are they actually looking at your production software and they're taking a look at here's what you're invoicing versus here's what's been collected. And we're making sure that all of those things are reconciled against each other. That's a little bit more work, but it's way more useful for you as a leader for your company to be able to see all of that information together. So typically, if you think about like the higher complexity your business is, the more softwares that you have speaking to each other, the more accounts that you have, the more loans that you have, your complexity is going to go up and your rates are going to go up in tandem.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Tell me a bit about the consulting side of it, this kind of CFO level stuff that you kind of have going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I don't do CFO work any longer. So I'm sorry to say, I do occasionally get requests from people who are looking for CFO level services. I don't do that directly right now. I do still do a lot of that same level of advisory as part of my consulting or as part of my coaching. And, continuing to offer that on a broader scale is a big thing that I'm really interested in doing through the Pro Painter Network. So that's why I designed the Contractor Lab, which is a part of my membership offering. That's like a big open forum weekly call. So I figured one of the best values that I could drive for members is just making myself available for an hour and a half every week, same time, same place. Hop in, ask me questions. I can answer things. We can small group stuff, hot seat things, and I can point you to additional resources. So that's a really great way to tap into my particular knowledge and skill set. But in general, CFO level work would be considered higher level advisory, and it's going to be a little bit more related to strategic thinking and being able to exercise a lot of deductive logic, I guess, around financials. So I like to remind people that when it comes to the financials in the business, there's kind of two separate roles. There's people who track things. They're doing all of the labeling. They're making sure that they're tracking down missing information. They're making sure that everything in the books is accurate. And then the second part of it is interpretive. It's interpretation. It's having the ability to go in and look at reports and to some extent identify, is something wrong here? Like, was it tracked properly or not? But the next level of it is actually being able to look at a financial report and say, this is what it tells me about the health of the business. In the past, I've kind of joked that it's almost like fortune telling when you get really good at looking at financial reports, because I can go in and look at a financial report for a business and an owner that I have never talked to before, and I can tell them so much about what's happening with their business on the ground, what their pain points are, probably what staff members they're struggling with. I know a lot of personal details about a lot of people when I get into the books, down to, for some of you, where you grocery shop, what movie theaters you like to frequent, how many subscription services you have in your home, because you guys are mixing personal and business things. So that CFO level is actually going to be much more focused on looking at those reports, helping you identify, this is what it's red flagging, or this is what it says is going really well. And here's the decision tree that we need to work down from this financial report about, what does it tell you about what you should be doing? What's the impact of those things that you're doing? What's the highest ROI on your time? So it's a little more interpretive and prescriptive, like making recommendations. That's not really something that you can expect from a bookkeeper. If you have a bookkeeper as a staff member, and for certain bookkeeping firms, you're going to want to identify, are they just doing bookkeeping, or do they have a level of advisory that's kind of geared towards that? Most accountants aren't really doing CFO work in that way. They might do it a little bit more around how to save you some money on taxes, but it's usually not operational. So a CFO type role I would usually consider to be pretty operationally focused and really trying to help you with strategy.
Perfect. And that's what I think what we've seen on our side as well, is that kind of there's a different way to approach the financials on the kind of higher end strategy level that we notice with, especially when people hit high seven figures, start to get into eight figures, that really becomes a necessity. What are some of the non-negotiables that you would, what are some non-negotiables for you when it comes to finances with entrepreneurs who want to grow bigger businesses?
I will not work with any businesses on a coaching or consulting front who don't outsource their bookkeeping if they're between a certain size. So if you're over, if you're right around 300,000 to up to 2 to 3 million a year in revenue, you need to have an outsourced bookkeeper, or I won't work with you, because you're not embracing efficiencies. Also, on one hand, it's because you're not being efficient in your tracking. And in the past, when I have worked with businesses that are trying to kind of do it themselves or keep it in-house, the reporting's not good. It's not good enough to actually do good work off of. So I found that that's a really helpful metric there. That's like, if you're really serious about this, you're going to have to embrace doing it like a professional would do it, which would mean not keeping it all under one hat or keeping it to yourself, or overloading one staff member when your team is not actually big enough to support a full-time bookkeeper. So usually you're not big enough to support a full-time bookkeeper or accountant, especially as a painting business, until you're about 3 million a year in revenue. And you shouldn't have it in-house unless that person is full-time. Another big reason behind that is that if you can't have a full-time person only doing bookkeeping, but not moving money, which means that they are never collecting payments and they are never paying bills and they are never cutting payroll checks, you can't afford to keep it in-house if you can't keep those two roles separate from each other. So if you have an admin who is doing a little bit of everything, if they have what I call transactional privilege, they're moving money around, and you have them doing bookkeeping, that's a massive no-no. It's a huge security risk and breach. And that's one of those things where I'm going to tell you not to do it. And personally, for working together, if you're like, well, no, we're going to do it anyway, I'm like, well, then we're not a good fit to work together. So that's
Okay.
one of those foundational pieces. Like, if I'm going to help you get better and get safer as a business, then that's a non-negotiable. Did that fully answer your question, or was there another element to your question?
No, that was good. I have follow up to that. But to hit on that last part, the thing that happens and why that's so important. Do you know? Have you heard Mark Cuban's story with his first business?
Maybe not in particular, but it's probably a common one. Do you want to tell us what his story is in particular?
Yeah. So his first business, I think he had just started his first company. They had just made like, I can't remember, it was a couple $100,000 or something like that. And he talked about how he had just given bonuses to everyone. And then he got an alert saying that he had no money in his bank account. And he found out that his accountant had fled to Mexico and wrote himself a check for like $100,000 or something like that. Or his admin person or whatever. Is that kind of what you're talking about, the security breaches there?
Exactly right. Yeah. So whenever you're going through financial training, they talk about is that there are three things that have to be in place for somebody to take advantage of what's going on in the business. And they say it's means, motive, and opportunity. Okay. So motive is the one that you have to assume that everyone has motive. Everyone has motive for having more money. So motive is always there no matter what. You actually can't remove motive. The only time motive's not there is if it's you yourself managing your own financials because you don't have motive to steal from yourself. That doesn't make sense. So the other two variables that you have are means and opportunity. Those are the only two things that we have the ability to try to remove. So opportunity is the piece that we're trying to remove here, right? There's absolutely no way for somebody to have the opportunity to waylay money and then cover it up if they don't have the ability to move money and do the bookkeeping. If they have the ability to do both, if they can move money and they're the one tracking things, then they can cover things up. I have seen, unfortunately, businesses that have done a good job separating these two, but then they actually have people in those roles who are related to each other. So they have somebody who's in the same family, and then that has created an opportunity for there to be an issue. So yeah, means and opportunity are almost kind of the same thing in this way, but means is like a mechanical function. Opportunity is just the open door, the ability to go in and do that. So when we're designing robust systems in a business, we're really trying to be very strategic about removing that. Another piece of that's cash handling. The more that you have cash handling in your business, the more that you are opening that business up for major fraud issues. So I always recommend that people reduce the amount of cash that they're handling in the business at any given time and be very explicit with their teams, be very explicit with their customers about how they're going to be billing and how they're going to be collecting payment. Because that's another one that I've seen staff members actually directing customers to make payments in ways that are illegitimate. So like wire fraud, wire transfers to not a business related bank account, or cutting a check to a name that's not the actual business's name or something like that. So the more clear you can be with your customers from the very beginning and educate them about this is how our process works as a business, this is how we're going to bill you, and this is the legitimate way of doing business with us, the harder you're going to make it for any of your staff members or even a hacker to potentially come in and take advantage.
Okay. Is it okay to have a sub or a project manager or whatever go pick up the final check?
As long as you've been really clear with your customer about who that final check needs to be made out to. So you have to have you have to have that education piece there, right? Like it needs to be clearly stated on all of your documentation. This is how checks are made out to. This is who collects checks. There needs to be some sort of sign off there too. I would always want people to leave a receipt or something if they're picking up a check so that, both of them have signed off on the fact that they passed it off. But as far as having somebody pick up a check, you just need to be really clear with people who checks need to be made out to. So kind of an example of this for check fraud, but also for wire fraud. My husband and I experienced this once actually with a flooring contractor. So a flooring contractor was directing us it was his office person. It was his office manager who was doing it. We're almost certain, although she denied it and he took her side. So that was really problematic in that interaction. But she directed us to wire funds for a project to an account that had a name that was very similar to the business owner's personal name. So it was like the business owner's name, LLC, or something like that. So it was like they had created an LLC and created a bank account to sound similar to the business owner's name or to sound similar to the business name. So you've got to be careful about that because people can do that. And then they can direct people to write checks to a name that is not the correct name or something like that. So is everywhere you can be as clear as possible how you're going to collect payment and what they're going to make it out to.
Okay. So guys, super smart. If you're not going to pick up the checks yourself, make sure you put in there and the homeowner's educated. It's written down exactly who they're writing the check to. So there's no issues.
Yeah. There's no room for he said, she said. There's none of that.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
What is the last question with this? And then I want to get into some of the Pro Painter Network stuff. Also, I want to respect your time. So I did have a question about is it Contractor Lab?
Yeah, the Contractor Lab.
Yeah. So there's a group meeting where they're coming in. What kind of questions are being asked? I'm almost thinking as a business owner, how would I engage that? What are they looking to get out of that? Right. What kind of questions are they getting? What is that?
Totally great question. So the Contractor Lab is going to be an open forum call, really similar maybe to some other roundtable sessions that we've invited people to participate in the past. And I'm modeling it pretty closely after the style of other types of group coaching that I've done in the past. But this is going to be larger group rather than small group coaching. So the idea here is that it's really flexible. We can use time for whatever contractors need. And I'm fairly confident that most of the time, whenever I sit down with contractors, they have pain points. They have things that are going on right now in the business that they show up and they're like, this is what's going on. Let's talk about it. I need some answers or I need some questions about best practices for what you guys are seeing. So the first piece of this is the idea of facilitation of, an open forum where contractors can get together every week to talk about what they're seeing, what's trending, what's impacting them. Thankfully, our Facebook groups have great engagement. So we see a lot of awesome engagement in the Business Brush group. And I'm also thankfully an admin and a moderator in several other industry groups. So those are really great places for us to look at and identify trending topics of confusion or things that people want to talk about. So I can always pull from that content for any of our sessions. People come in and they're like, what's going on? I don't have any questions, but I just want to hear what's the news? We'll use that as a guiding resource. And I spend a lot of time actively coaching in a lot of different industry spaces. So thankfully, I have a really great repository of other things that I'm teaching to people all the time and hearing from other industry spaces about what's the problem, what's the issue, or what's working well. So I can always bring that back into our open work forums as well.
I love it. Perfectly answered my question. All right, so we're right at time. Are there any questions I didn't ask or we dive into that you kind of wanted to as we're on our way out?
This was really robust. So I think this was a really, really good discussion as far as what you should be looking for, what kind of potential problem points people bump into. So I have to really hand it to you, Jake. That was a really good lineup of questions. It was a perfect setup for hitting all the highlights.
Awesome. Thank you. We try hard.
Absolutely. Yeah, you do.
All right, guys. So this was Morgan. I had so much fun. I think there's going to be a ton of value that's going to come out of this. If you guys want to know more, what do you got going on? How can they reach you?
Totally. Best way to connect with me would be find me on Facebook, Morgan Knox EA. You guys could always come connect at the Business Brush group if you're a painting contractor. And you can head on over to propainternetwork.com and check out what we have going on over there.
Awesome. And there it is. Thank you so much for being on. We'll see you guys in the next episode.